Well, howdy, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for joining our live stream today. This is 2 weeks in a row, so this is like a streak for us. We're doing awesome. How you doing, Roy?
I'm doing well, James. Yourself?
Doing good.
Good.
Good. Yeah. Thanks for tuning in, or if you're watching it later on, we appreciate you taking the time today. So last week, Roy and I did one of these for the first time, and we were talking about our rebranding and all the excitement that goes in with that, and our new vision and our new mission, and where God's leading us as a ministry. And so today, we're actually going to tackle a question you can see on the description as foster care, the future of Christian heritage. And so really, as we move into a new season of ministry, and we really emphasize prevention work, especially through Families Together, keeping kids out of the system, a new brand, it feels different, it looks different. It's easy and it's logical to just ask the question, well, are you going to keep doing foster care? Is that still in the plans? Is that still in the heart of the ministry? So that's really what we're going to talk about today. But before we get there, we want to talk about really the current state of foster care nationally, but also here in Nebraska. So Roy, maybe you could just speak to that as we kind of kick it off. You know, as you look around the landscape of child welfare in our state and nationally, you know, what are you seeing? What are some trends? How are things going? What are some things, you know, the people that are watching, what should they know about when it comes to foster care?
Yeah, I'm really excited that we started doing this because one of the things, James, we've talked a lot about, and, when we think about the entire agency, is people really have to understand a little bit about what's going on, who we are, what we're doing. And hopefully, again, if you haven't checked out our rebranding video last week that we put out, highly encourage you to go revisit that. I think it'll put in some context, some of the conversations, some of the things that we'll talk about today. But to go at a higher level before you even just unpack foster care, I think what's been true of us as Christian heritage for 40 plus years is our response to vulnerable children and families. Yep. That's the heart of that. I think obviously, the way that you meet those needs, people begin to identify, you by the programs you offer. And obviously people think of us as strictly as a foster care child placing agency. Yep. And again, that is a big part of who we have been. And it will continue to be a big part of who we are moving forward. Yep. But we're not primarily that. We are primarily an organization that cares for widows and orphans. That's the biblical mandate that we take seriously. And so our response to that is, where are the vulnerable children and families? How do we mobilize gospel-centered faith communities around that, where vulnerable children families are? And just like our culture is rapidly changing, how we meet that need is going to continue to evolve through the course of any organization. And so I think part of that is at a really high level. I think when people ask, hey, I'm hearing about Families Together, I hear about Beyond Prison, are you still doing foster care? And the simple answer to that is yes, because there's vulnerable children that are in the foster care, yep. And they're in that space. And so we will continue to be resolute in where those children are at. We will continue to provide whatever programs and services that we can do that without ultimately compromising who we are and what we believe who we are in that. And so I think just as we think about, Christian heritage, and so that then to your question is, child welfare nationally is rapidly changing, but even locally in Nebraska, it's rapidly changing. So I would say some of these things are post-pandemic. Some of these things, as many who know Christian heritage, we've been through significant challenges over the last 7 years. With our founders, Greg and Lisa, passing away, and this transition for us, as an organization, when you lose your founder, those aren't small things. They are big things, because you lose your vision, you lose your fundraiser, you lose, in a lot of ways, the heart of the organization. And again, we've had some amazing people that have served the organization. We continue to have amazing people that serve that, but that's a big part for Christian heritage. Our response to, the local needs, the needs that are happening in the foster care system, And so even for us, we've had to juggle and manage, our own threats internally with so much shifting and changes, here internally.
Yep.
But again, we're up for, really, again, continue to position the organization well in regards to responding to that need.
Yeah.
So, foster care nationally, there's a national foster care shortage. I mean, the pandemic has played a huge impact on that.
Yeah.
And I think anyone who says, well, we'll just return to normal after the pandemic, I think it's just sheer foolishness. There's not an organization or institution that right now that is not, responding and having to innovate and really look at, what they offer and how they do that. Every institution. And so we're no different than that. And so part of that is post-pandemic. We're seeing a national shortage. Many states are dealing with shortages of foster families. Staffing issues is another huge issue of recruitment of qualified staff, specialists, those who are in the field, licensing, all of those who have the right qualifications, which again has had a huge impact on, what we offer from salary and benefits, and, how do we attract, the right candidates to really support what's going on in the foster care system. So that has been a real challenge for us as well as we think about, what's going on in the foster care system. There's a huge emphasis in reunification. And so we think about, we talk a lot about in foster care, relative kinship and this need for, stabilizing, children who, are, found in abuse or neglect. How do we stabilize that? Well, let's keep them with, within the family, a grandparent, aunt and uncle, a cousin. And so, there's less of the traditional foster care system that's, moving away. Federal funding, state funding is moving away from the traditional foster care. So, how do we as an organization come along, relative kinship? And then the needs of kids that we're serving. Many people that might not know this, but in Nebraska this past year, we've gone from a 3-tier kind of foster care system to a 5-tier. And so there's a higher level of professional care that's needed for, the needs of the kids that we see coming in here. Still a huge need for teenagers and sibling strips, and finding the right foster families who have a heart and passion for that. And so, a lot of these challenges have been pretty institutional as long as I've been in foster care. Even in my days when I was in Pennsylvania working at a foster care agency, trying to find people who want to foster teenagers and sibling strips. That's always been a challenge, and that continues to be. But I think even more so after the pandemic, that's created some unique challenges, not just for Christian Heritage, but for every, child placing agency in our state, but nationwide.
That's good. I want to come back in a minute to that last part about the different levels of care. And some people, you guys listening, you might be thinking like, what does it take to be a foster parent? What kind of people are they looking for? What kind of kids need to be cared for? I'm going to come back to that. But I think, Roy, all those are some of those challenges are huge. And what I always come back to, I think about, and a lot of you listening, you might not know this, like, in central and eastern Nebraska, I guess just east of, the Tri-County area, we're the only evangelical Christian organization doing this. And so that to me is just incredible motivation to say, God's got us in the right space. So all those obstacles that you just mentioned, it might be easy to go, well, it just seems like it's a lot of work. It's really hard. Why don't you just focus on one thing or do something else? But God has us in that space for a reason, because as we've articulated, and we said this last week, like, God's people are the answer. And we believe that we need Christian foster parents. Unequivocally, we need Christian foster parents. And so that's why we do what we do.
Well, and so let's take this at a really large level. Even before the pandemic, John Hopkins, less than half of teenagers, children in the U.S. right now are flourishing. I mean, less than half. That was pre-pandemic. I guarantee those numbers. Mental health in teens and children are off the charts, right? So, I think about suicide rates. There's been a 5-fold increase in suicide attempts in children ages 10 to 12 in the last 10 years. A 5-fold increase.
Nuts.
So when we talked a little bit about this last week, so when we talk about vulnerable children and families, in the past, there was a larger element that I would say of healthy families that I think were able to respond to the needs of those who are more vulnerable. What we're seeing is a national trend, really, of a mental health epidemic within our youth. And families, in the breakdown of the family, is it's not getting any better. And so because of that, the need is greater than it ever has been. And so back to your point, for us just to say we want to just be in the foster care system, well, we know the foster care system, and there are so many incredible people in the child welfare system who are exhausting themselves, but the burnout rate for caseworkers is really high. Their caseloads are unmanageable. And again, we've seen that in the news here in Nebraska. We think about St. Francis, in the eastern part of the state, and how DHHS had to come in. There's funding issues. So there's a lot of things that are going on. And so again, our heart, when we think about children, right? This isn't about us protecting a program. Yeah. This is about us helping children flourish. That's the end state. That's the end game in all of this. Is the story for us. If our hearts are broken over that, like if our hearts aren't moved and broken about that. And so as we think about the foster care system, we have to be very intentional of not just being a participant in that, but we need to be actively engaged in making it better. How do we make this institution better? And we believe the answer is the church. Yep. And if we can keep kids out of the system, then all of a sudden the system that is overwhelmed is no longer overwhelmed, right? So it becomes more manageable. And the more that we can do that, then kids are going to end up flourishing. And so that's really, when we think about our role in this, we're not just a taker. Like, we want to be a giver, like a kingdom giver, advancing his kingdom within, Lincoln and Omaha, but I would say in the state of Nebraska when it comes to vulnerable children. So all of these systems are imploding on themselves. And if we sit idly by as the church, it's an incredibly, I think that grieves God if we're not moved to wanting to do something for vulnerable children. And what we're saying is we're all in, right? We're all in, we're resolute in this endeavor, and we're going to do everything we can to protect children, keep kids safe, whether it's inside or outside of the foster care system. Is really kind of that, putting that in a nutshell for us.
Roy just threw out a lot of data, stories, references to things. We'll put those links in the comments after this video, so you can read some of the news stories, some of the articles, some of the research studies that have gone on. Roy mentioned John Hopkins studies. There's a lot of things, like, we're not making this up out of thin air, or we just don't have a few data points, anecdotes that we're saying, oh, well, the whole thing's crumbling. No, there's a lot of hard evidence out there that shows the system is failing children. That's kind of a phrase we use a lot, even inside here at CH, is the system is failing children. And so that's why our heart is not just, oh, we want to put some Band-Aids on things, but we're trying to, within, God's people, within local churches, create a whole new system where children can flourish. And so we try to do that as much as we can with foster care. And then obviously we're doing that on the preservation side through Families Together. So now, just in our last few minutes, let's talk about, we don't just want you guys to have great information. Roy and I don't want that at all. Some of you listening are like, maybe God is nudging you toward foster care. Maybe you feel explicitly calling you to foster care. But, the state of Nebraska here, they're looking for specific kinds of people to do foster care, or I should say people to do specific kinds of care. And so, Roy, maybe you could speak to that a little bit. What's the state, as you've talked to them, what are they looking for? What kind of kids are coming into care? Who needs the most help?
We already kind of tackled that. And again, this is nothing new. This is, like I said, when I was in foster care, in the early 2000s, we needed teenagers, people who'd taken teenagers and sibling strips. And so the need in foster care is teenagers and sibling strips. And so, our heart as an organization is to continue to recruit, foster families or people who are interested in caring for that population, so to speak. That's where the greatest need is. I would say our average age right now of kids coming into foster care between the ages of 10, 11, 12 years of age. And so obviously that continues to be a high need for us to continue to meet those needs. And so again, if you feel called to come into foster care, like we welcome that. We need more homes. We need more beds to be able to serve, the population of foster care that that's going on right now and the needs that are there.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, it's such a huge need, and we don't want to overwhelm with statistics, but
Right.
when kids enter foster care, they're 4 times as likely to attempt suicide. Roy alluded to that other statistic earlier. They're half as likely to graduate high school on time. I mean, 60% of people who are trafficked spent time in foster care.
Mm-hmm.
About one fifth of the prison population was in foster care. So these are significant things. And so if we want to keep kids out of foster care, but once they enter, if they have and build loving connections and they're surrounded with a loving community of God's people, right, their chances of flourishing, their chances of success in life go way up.
Right.
It takes someone, maybe you're listening, it takes someone who's special to say, I'm going to be in this person and this person's life, this kid's life. I'm not going to give up on them. And my community is going to surround them with support. And that's really what we need when it comes to foster parents.
Well, exactly. And again, I think for us, our heart as an organization is how do we mobilize God's people to respond in such a way. So I'll pull out a study out of Harvard. Harvard looked at, resilience in children, and they've done specific studies on how religion plays a significant factor in human flourishing. Yeah. So again, as a faith-based organization, at some level, I could make an argument that kids within Christian heritage, when Christian homes open up their hearts and their homes to a vulnerable child, that because they are practicing believers, who believe in getting their kids to church weekly, who maybe think about Bible study, think about praying together as a family. Harvard has incredible research that says when kids do that, they're less likely to be depressed. There's less stressors in their life. There's human flourishing. Now, again, for us in the church, why we shouldn't be surprised by that, and we shouldn't be surprised by that. Mm-hmm. But it does take our ability as a home, as a parent, to say, is this a good thing for us to do? And I would say it is a good thing for you to do and assess. And ultimately, you need to be found obedient to the Lord's leading in your life, just like what we have. Like a lot of our staff are like, hey, we care about this deeply. How do we mobilize God's people around the most hurting in our communities? And I would say, the last thing I would say about that is we need to help the church, and we're part of the church, is to make it feel safe again. I mean, I think there's so many barriers where the church is no longer seen as the lighthouse, that city on a hill. Mm-hmm. We are a safe place to really reach our communities with the gospel. And I can't think of a better way to reach the gospel. And I'm not talking about, throwing Bible verses. I'm talking about, caring for the most vulnerable and embodying what, the love of Christ with people who might not ever enter the church, the doorway of a church. That is our goal. Is we want to help you do that and support you in that. Now, we don't do that perfectly. I'll tell you that right now. I mean, child welfare and working with families and our own stuff, man, it's messy. But our commitment is to really see lives change because of our willingness to be found faithful to what God is leading us and calling us to do.
I love that. So if you're listening and you're watching and you're like, I feel kind of a nudge, I feel like God might be calling us to that. We want to have, an action step for you. And obviously you can always reach out to us at any time. And I'll also add, if you're curious about the future of foster care and our involvement in it, please reach out to us. Reach out to Roy, reach out to me.
Yeah.
We'd love to talk. But one thing I will mention, and if you get our newsletter or you follow us on social media, you see that we've talked about this thing called becoming a trauma responsive community. And that might be a good first step for you to kind of dip your toe in the water, to learn a little bit about trauma and learn a little bit about how a church community can surround people who are struggling. We have some of these planned throughout the rest of the year here in Lincoln. We have one in Omaha. And so it's a step before you just go, I'm all in, I'm going to take foster parent training, right, and I'm going to do it. You might need to dip your toe in the water. And so you could follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter. You'll get all that information for those trainings that are coming up. Now, if you're outside of Omaha or Lincoln, and I'm not committing us to anything, but if you're like, I'd love to figure out how to be a part of that, contact us, and we will at least have a conversation and figure out how to serve you wherever you're at. So I just wanted to throw that out there, because I know, as a former foster parent, it's scary. It's scary to think, I'm committing to doing this. I'm going to take this really long training, and I don't know what God's going to do. But I'm all in. Well, it's okay to say, I want to take a little baby step first. So that's really what becoming a trauma responsive community is designed to do, is to bridge that gap between, I have a heart and I don't know if I'm all in yet. Well, that's what that's there for.
Well, and to say, again, this is a shift for us. Like, people like, well, it seems different. It sounds different. I'm going to say it's the same, but we're offering things very differently. And so part of that is our partnership with the church. We were using an analogy earlier in a meeting today, and I loved it. James was using this fishing analogy. And part of it is, the way we used to do things is like, hey, we come to the church. Hey, do you have anybody interested in foster care parent? We like send out the single line. What we're doing now is actually kind of twofold, is we're casting these really large nets into the church, saying we're doing lots of different things. But ultimately what we want to do is, and by the way, whether that's becoming a part of our Families Together program, the prison work we're doing, and, reaching families impacted by incarceration, whether that is becoming a foster care parent, we're casting a wider net. And this is why. Because ultimately what we want to be able to do is make the church the hero, and ultimately make Jesus the hero in the story. Because what we know about trauma, the only way to counter trauma is connection. Well, who can do not just short-term, but generational connection? It's the church. Yeah. No other institution can do it the way the church can. And so our goal is not to just to cast a net and say, hey, we're offering these things. What we want to do is equip and inspire the church to be better at what it's doing. Right. So it's like mobilizing fish in the lake, and not to be coming in, but to go out and say, oh my goodness, let's reach our communities for Jesus Christ. And that is ultimately our end game. And that is a shift. I think it's always been true to who we are. So I don't think it's that, but we're emphasizing it very differently than we have in the past. So when people ask, are you guys still doing foster care? Yes, very, very much so. As long as we can, we will do that. And we're committed to it. But again, that's why it feels differently. That's why it sounds a little differently, but it really is coming true to who we've always have been.
Amen. I love that. Well, we'll stop for today. Thanks so much for tuning in and watching. We will be back next week for another conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Roy. Have a great day.